The flight that almost wasn't. Cynthia Taylor stood at the airport check-in counter, a picture of calm. A black woman in her mid-40s, she wore a simple outfit of jeans and a navy blue sweater. Her suitcase, which she dragged behind her, had traveled the world with her, but today it was as unremarkable as her appearance. To any casual observer, Cynthia looked like any other passenger. She blended into the sea of travelers, unnoticed. But for Cynthia, this was far from an ordinary flight. As Admiral of the United States Navy, her trip to Washington, D.C. was not a casual one. She was due at an international summit, one where decisions would be made that could reshape global policies on maritime security. As she approached the check-in counter, she felt a quiet urgency bubbling beneath her composed demeanor. Every minute counted. She handed her ticket to the attendant, a young woman with a perfectly polished appearance. At first, the attendant smiled mechanically, but when her eyes traveled from the ticket to Cynthia's face, the shift was unmistakable. A flicker of doubt crossed her expression, followed by the unspoken judgment Cynthia knew all too well. The attendant glanced down at Cynthia's casual clothes and her ID card. "Can I help you?" she asked in a tone layered with suspicion, as if Cynthia might have mistakenly wandered into first class. Cynthia took a deep breath, pushing down the twinge of discomfort that was creeping in. This wasn't the first time she had been met with such skepticism, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I'm on flight 624 to Washington, D.C. first class." The attendant's fingers hovered uncertainly over the keyboard. She looked back at Cynthia, her eyes narrowing slightly as if calculating whether the woman in front of her belonged in such a class. "Are you sure this is your flight?" the attendant asked, her voice laced with doubt. Cynthia blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the question. "Yes, I'm sure. I'm Admiral Cynthia Taylor of the United States Navy. I'm on official business." She pulled out her military ID and handed it over along with her ticket. The attendant's eyes widened for a moment before quickly masking the reaction. She studied the ID longer than necessary, as though trying to find some fault in it. After an uncomfortable silence, she finally spoke again, but her words didn't ease Cynthia's growing frustration. "We'll need to verify this," the attendant said, calling over a colleague. Cynthia watched as a young man named John approached the counter. He looked at her, then back at the attendant, and an unspoken exchange passed between them. John took the ID from the attendant and examined it, flipping it back and forth as though expecting it to reveal some hidden truth. Cynthia's pulse quickened, but she held her composure. She had learned long ago to never let her emotions betray her. "This seems unusual," John muttered, his voice barely audible. Cynthia's patience was wearing thin. "It's not unusual," she said, keeping her voice even. "I'm on my way to a summit. If you could expedite this process, I would appreciate it." John didn't look convinced. He excused himself, walking away with her ID, leaving Cynthia standing at the counter. Her thoughts raced. Each passing minute felt like a wasted opportunity. The summit she was attending would bring together some of the world's most powerful figures. Every second mattered. And yet here she was, being scrutinized not for her credentials, but for the simple fact that she didn't fit into someone's preconceived idea of what an admiral should look like. The seconds stretched into minutes, and Cynthia felt the stares of other passengers starting to land on her. She heard the whispers, the quiet judgments from people behind her in line. The murmurs, the disapproving looks, they were familiar to her, but that didn't make them any easier to bear. She had spent a lifetime breaking down barriers, and yet here she was, once again being forced to prove she belonged. Finally, John returned, this time with a supervisor in tow. The man, older and wearing an air of authority, glanced at her briefly before turning his attention to the ID in John's hand. "We're just verifying a few things," the supervisor said, his tone cold and impersonal. "Is there a problem?" Cynthia asked, her voice still calm but firmer now. "I've provided my ID. I've explained that I'm on official business. I don't understand the delay. The supervisor looked at her, his expression unreadable. Routine procedure, he said dismissively. Cynthia felt a surge of frustration rise within her. Routine, she thought to herself. There was nothing routine about this. She knew that all too well. She knew this wasn't about security or protocol. This was about doubt. Doubt that a black woman in casual clothes could hold such a prestigious title. Doubt that someone like her could be worthy of the status printed on her ID. It was the same doubt that had followed her throughout her career. The same doubt she had worked tirelessly to dispel. The minutes dragged on. The line of passengers behind her grew, and with it, the impatience of those waiting. A man in a business suit behind her let out an exaggerated sigh of frustration. "What's the holdup?" He muttered loudly enough for her to hear. "Is she even supposed to be in this line?" Cynthia felt her grip tighten on the handle of her suitcase. She had expected challenges at the summit, debates over international waters, discussions about naval strategy. But this, she hadn't expected this. She forced herself to breathe, to maintain the composure that had seen her through countless battles, both on and off the field. Finally, the supervisor handed her ID back to John, who walked over to Cynthia, his demeanor no less skeptical than before. "We've cleared everything, ma'am," John said, though his tone made it clear that no apology would be forthcoming. "You can proceed to the gate." Cynthia took her ID, resisting the urge to say more. Her mind was already shifting ahead to the summit, to the discussions that awaited her. She had no time for arguments here. Instead, she thanked him, her voice as composed as ever, and walked toward the gate, feeling the eyes of the other passengers still lingering on her. But as she moved through the airport, the tension in her chest slowly began to ease. She had endured. She had been patient. She had won, not by shouting or demanding, but by standing firm in the knowledge of who she was and what she had achieved. The flight attendants, the passengers, even the supervisor, they had all doubted her, but Cynthia Taylor didn't need their validation. She was Admiral Cynthia Taylor of the United States Navy. And nothing, no glance, no whisper, no misplaced doubt, could change that. Rising above the noise, Cynthia Taylor walked through the terminal, her steps steady but her mind still whirling. The irritation from the encounter at the check-in counter lingered, like a storm cloud that refused to dissipate. She had faced many battles throughout her career, both on the seas and within the tightly wound corridors of military command. But none cut as deep as the quiet, relentless questioning of her worth. It was a battle she had fought since the beginning of her career. A battle not against enemies from foreign lands, but against the invisible barriers of perception, judgment, and bias. As she approached security, she mentally prepared herself for another round of scrutiny. She knew the drill all too well. Her ID would be checked again, her bag scanned meticulously, and perhaps another subtle glance would be cast her way. But Cynthia had learned over the years how to stay composed, how to armor herself with an impenetrable calm. She often likened herself to a ship navigating treacherous waters, steady, unshaken by the waves crashing against her hull. And yet even the sturdiest vessels could feel the toll of constant wear. She handed her boarding pass to the security officer, who scanned it without much of a glance, before ushering her toward the metal detectors. Cynthia walked through with practiced ease, her suitcase rolling behind her, its wheels making soft clicking sounds against the floor. The security line moved faster than she anticipated, a small relief after the prolonged delay at check-in. However, just as she reached the end of the security checkpoint, a young officer, perhaps in his early 20s, stopped her with a raised hand. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely, though there was an edge of nervousness in his voice. "I need to do an additional check on your bag." Cynthia nodded, offering no resistance, though inside she felt a familiar knot tightening in her stomach. It was always the same. Additional checks, further scrutiny, more questions. Her rank didn't shield her from these experiences. In fact, it often exacerbated them. It was as if people couldn't reconcile her achievements with her appearance. She looked at the officer, who was fumbling slightly as he put on a pair of latex gloves, preparing to rifle through her belongings. "It's just routine," he explained, but Cynthia could hear the hesitation in his voice. She could tell he wasn't accustomed to dealing with someone like her, someone who carried authority and dignity, yet didn't fit the mold of what society expected. "Of course," she said, her tone smooth and unbothered. She placed her suitcase on the table, unzipping it herself to make the process quicker. As the officer sifted through her carefully packed clothes, Cynthia found herself momentarily lost in thought. How many times had she stood in similar situations? How many times had she been stopped, questioned, second-guessed? Far too many to count. She thought back to her early days in the Navy, the moments when she first realized that her journey would be different from her peers. The moments when she understood that her gender, her race, and her status as a civilian before joining the military would mark her as different. She had learned to rise above it all, to keep her head held high even when the weight of it all threatened to drag her down. The officer completed his inspection, finding nothing of note, and stepped back. "You're good to go, Mom," he said, giving her a somewhat sheepish smile. "Thank you," Cynthia replied, offering him a nod before repacking her things. She didn't show any sign of frustration, but inside, the simmering sensation was there, a feeling she had long learned to suppress but never fully silenced. As she zipped up her suitcase and walked away, she took a deep breath, refocusing her mind on the task ahead. The international summit awaited her in Washington, D.C., a gathering of top naval officers and government leaders from around the world. She had been selected to represent the United States Navy, a testament to her leadership and expertise. But in these circles, as in many others, she knew she would once again be the minority, a black woman in a room full of powerful men. It wasn't something that frightened her. If anything, it motivated her. She had worked too hard, fought too long, to be intimidated by the barriers placed in her path. As she neared her gate, she saw the clusters of passengers sitting in the waiting area. Businessmen with briefcases, tourists with backpacks, families with strollers and excited children. Cynthia found a seat near the window, where she could catch a glimpse of the runway. The planes taking off and landing reminded her of the mission ahead, one far greater than herself. She wasn't just a naval officer heading to a conference. She was a symbol of progress, a reminder that the world was changing, even if not everyone could see it yet. She pulled out her tablet and began reviewing her notes for the summit. The topic was maritime security, a critical issue as tensions over international waters continued to rise. The meeting would cover everything from global piracy to the increasing presence of unmanned drones patrolling the seas. Cynthia had prepared extensively, as she always did, but she knew that her preparation wasn't just about knowledge. It was also about presence, making sure that she commanded the room, that her voice would be heard among the chorus of voices seeking dominance. As she reviewed the briefing materials, her mind drifted back to a conversation she had with her mentor, Rear Admiral Joseph Stanton, years ago when she was just a young officer. He had been one of the few who believed in her potential from the beginning, seeing past the doubts others had cast. "You're going to face challenges," he had told her, "but every time someone questions your place, you stand a little taller. You've earned every single step of your journey. Don't let anyone take that from you." His words had stayed with her, like a guiding light in moments of darkness, and they were with her now, as she prepared to step into yet another arena where she would have to prove herself again. Just then, her thoughts were interrupted by a voice over the intercom. "Flight 624 to Washington, D.C. is now boarding first-class passengers." Cynthia gathered her things, straightening her shoulders. She wasn't just boarding a flight. She was stepping into the next chapter of her story, one where the doubts and whispers of others would remain background noise. She had more important things to focus on. As she approached the gate, the same young attendant from the check-in counter was there, scanning tickets. Cynthia noticed the brief flicker of recognition in the attendant's eyes. The same hesitation, the same doubt. But this time, Cynthia didn't even bother acknowledging it. She handed over her boarding pass with a quiet confidence, her thoughts already far beyond the gate, far beyond the airport, focused on the mission ahead. "Enjoy your flight, Mom," the attendant said, her voice now neutral, perhaps even a little respectful. Cynthia simply nodded and walked down the jet bridge, her mind clear. She was Admiral Cynthia Taylor, and no matter how many stares, questions, or doubts were thrown her way, she would continue to rise above it all. The weight of the uniform. Cynthia Taylor sat in her first-class seat, gazing out of the small airplane window as the aircraft prepared for takeoff. The rhythmic hum of the engines rising to life provided a moment of solace after the tension-filled experiences that had preceded her arrival here. She adjusted herself in the spacious seat, allowing her mind to wander back to the days when flying first class was a distant dream, something only imagined during long nights at the academy, back when she was just another young woman with big dreams and bigger obstacles in her way. But now Cynthia was an admiral in the United States Navy, one of the most powerful, high-ranking women in her field. She had risen to the highest echelons of military leadership, commanding respect from her peers and recognition from global leaders. Yet despite all the accolades, despite the ribbons and stars adorning her uniform during formal ceremonies, there was an undeniable weight that came with her title, an invisible burden she carried that no one could see, but she felt every day. This weight wasn't the pressure of the responsibilities or the gravity of her decisions in the Navy. No, it was something much more personal, something that had followed her throughout her career and life. It was the weight of being seen through a lens of skepticism and doubt, the weight of constantly having to prove herself, again and again, despite her rank and accomplishments. And while she was not wearing her uniform now, the metaphorical weight of it rested heavily on her shoulders. The uniform had been both her shield and her burden. When she wore it, there was no mistaking who she was. Admiral Cynthia Taylor, a woman who had earned her place at the table of global military leadership. The uniform erased doubt, silenced questions, and commanded attention. But the moment she stepped out of it, she became someone else in the eyes of the world. Just another black woman, just another civilian. And the world had its own perceptions, its own judgments about where she did or didn't belong. Her uniform, then, was more than just a symbol of authority. It was a necessary armor against the biases she faced every day. As the plane ascended into the skies, Cynthia let her thoughts drift back to when she first donned the uniform that now defined her. It had been over 2 decades since she stood in front of her first commanding officer, the pristine white of her Naval Academy uniform crisp against her dark skin. She remembered how proud she had felt that day. It wasn't just about wearing the Navy's colors, it was about everything that uniform represented: honor, discipline, and a chance to lead. But as much as it represented those things, it also signified a barrier she would have to fight to break through. Even on that first day, the looks she received from her fellow cadets, the double takes from superiors, were clear signs that she was not what they expected. The Navy had its traditions, its unspoken rules, and its deep-rooted culture. And while it prided itself on being a force that transcended race, gender, and background, Cynthia knew the reality was more complicated. In a world dominated by white men, her presence was an anomaly, and people didn't know how to handle it. The weight of that reality had settled on her shoulders early in her career, long before she had earned her first star. But it was also what fueled her. Cynthia had never been content to simply blend in or to coast on her talent. She knew she had to work harder, be smarter, and move more strategically than her peers to reach the heights she had now attained. And she had. Each challenge she faced, from commanding naval fleets to navigating bureaucratic politics, had only strengthened her resolve. But no amount of rank, no number of accolades, could erase the weight of the expectations and the assumptions that constantly surrounded her. It wasn't just that people questioned her capabilities, they questioned her very right to be where she was. She remembered one of the most difficult times early in her career, when she had been assigned to lead her first major operation in the South China Sea. It was a crucial moment not only for the mission but for her career. She had to manage a team of seasoned naval officers, most of whom were older, white men with far more time in the field than she had. There had been murmurs, of course. They questioned whether Cynthia, a woman and a minority, could lead them in such a high-stakes situation. They didn't say it outright, but she could hear it in the way they spoke to each other in meetings, the way their eyes slid past her when discussing strategy. Their hesitation was a silent challenge. She could feel in every room she entered. But Cynthia had known better than to engage in any verbal battle or try to prove herself through words. She had learned long ago that action spoke louder than anything she could say. And so she focused on the mission. She stayed late in the war room, reviewing tactical plans, running simulations, and making decisions that ensured the success of their operation. Her leadership during that mission had been flawless, her strategies impeccable, and when the team returned successful, there was no longer any doubt about her abilities. But the victory was bittersweet. She had won the battle, but the war was ongoing. Her place would always be questioned. Now, more than a decade later, as an admiral, the stakes were higher and the scrutiny remained. Cynthia had come to accept that she would always be seen through a different lens, and while she could withstand the pressure, the weight of it never entirely disappeared. It was a constant reminder that her journey was not just about herself. It was about those who came after her, those who would follow in her footsteps, and those who would look to her as a trailblazer. As the plane leveled out, Cynthia closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of quiet. She knew the summit in Washington, D.C. would be challenging. She would be one of the few women in the room, and likely the only black woman. She would face the same skepticism she always did, her ideas scrutinized, her authority subtly questioned. But she was prepared, as she always was. She recalled a conversation she'd had with her late grandmother, a woman who had raised Cynthia after her parents passed away in a car accident when she was just a child. Her grandmother, a woman of incredible strength and resilience, had been her first role model. She had lived through the civil rights movement, and she had taught Cynthia the importance of perseverance. "You'll be the first in many rooms, Cynthia," her grandmother had once told her, her voice filled with wisdom. "And that's a burden, no doubt. But it's also a gift. You have the chance to show them what they've never seen before, to teach them something they didn't even know they needed to learn." Cynthia had carried those words with her ever since. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind every time she walked into a boardroom, every time she stood before a room full of skeptical eyes. She had the power to change perceptions, to shatter the glass ceilings that were still in place, to pave the way for future generations of women and minorities who would follow in her footsteps. As the flight attendant passed by, Cynthia smiled politely and declined the offer of a drink. She didn't need anything to calm her nerves. She had already mastered the art of finding calm within herself, no matter the chaos surrounding her. The International Summit was about more than just maritime security. It was about the future of naval operations, about how the world's most powerful countries would navigate the increasingly complex global landscape. And Cynthia knew she had a vital role to play. She had earned her place at the table. Now it was time to remind the world why she was there. As the plane cruised toward Washington, D.C., Cynthia felt the weight of her uniform, though she wasn't wearing it. It was a weight she would always carry. But it was also the reason she walked with such dignity and purpose. The weight of her uniform was the weight of history, progress, and change. She was Admiral Cynthia Taylor of the United States Navy, and the world had better get used to it. The summit's undercurrents. Cynthia Taylor stepped off the plane into the brisk autumn air of Washington, D.C. The sharpness of the breeze against her face was a welcome contrast to the tension-filled flight. Despite the turbulence of emotion she had navigated before boarding, she felt a sense of clarity now. Her feet touched the ground of a city that was both familiar and challenging, a place where decisions of global significance were made, where power played itself out in both overt and subtle ways. Her mind was focused on the summit, but there was no denying the complexities beneath its surface. This wasn't just another gathering of naval officers and world leaders discussing maritime policies. It was a battlefield of intellect, diplomacy, and political power, where alliances were made and broken, and where every word, every gesture, was carefully weighed. She had been in these rooms before, felt the unspoken judgments, the skeptical glances, but she knew how to play the game. She had to. Her presence alone was enough to disrupt the status quo, and she was ready to use that to her advantage. As the car service whisked her away from the airport toward her hotel, Cynthia's thoughts turned to the summit's agenda. On the surface, it was straightforward. A series of discussions about global maritime security, cooperation on anti-piracy efforts, and the regulation of unmanned drones in international waters. But Cynthia understood the undertones beneath these topics: the rise of new naval powers, shifting alliances, and the looming question of how to navigate a world where tensions between major superpowers were escalating. These were the real matters at hand. In the weeks leading up to the summit, Cynthia had pored over intelligence reports, analyzed satellite imagery, and held briefing after briefing with her team. The South China Sea, a region where she had once commanded, remained a hotspot, with its vital shipping lanes and contested territories. China's expanding naval presence and the U.S. response to it would undoubtedly dominate many of the behind-closed-doors conversations. But there were other layers to consider: Russia's increasing military exercises in the Arctic, Iran's strategic influence over the Strait of Hormuz, and the growing capabilities of smaller nations who were no longer content to be passive actors on the world stage. For Cynthia, the stakes were personal. The decisions made at this summit would directly impact her role as a top-ranking naval officer, and by extension, the thousands of service members who looked to her for leadership. But beyond that, this summit represented another opportunity to challenge the narratives that surrounded her. She wasn't just another voice in the room. She was a black woman who had risen to the top of a field that had historically been dominated by men. And not just any men, but predominantly white men from privileged backgrounds. Every decision she made, every argument she presented, carried the weight of that reality. Her car pulled up to the Mandarin Oriental Hotel, a location known for hosting dignitaries and high-profile events. Cynthia stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement as she entered the grand lobby. She had been here before, for briefings and high-level meetings, but this time felt different. This time, she wasn't just attending, she was leading. The U.S. Navy had chosen her to represent their interests at the summit, a significant endorsement of her leadership and expertise. As she checked in and rode the elevator up to her room, Cynthia's thoughts returned to the summit's participants. There would be familiar faces, colleagues and allies from years of international collaboration, but there would also be new ones. Some of the nations attending were sending younger, more ambitious naval officers, eager to make their mark on the world stage. And then there were the diplomats and political figures, individuals with their own agendas, carefully navigating the intersection of military strategy and international relations. In these rooms, everyone was a player, and everyone had something to gain or lose. Once in her room, Cynthia unpacked, her mind already running through the possible scenarios she would face in the coming days. She carefully hung up her uniform, the navy blue and gold reflecting the years of service, the stars on her shoulder reminding her of the hard-won battles she had fought to reach this point. She took a moment to admire the uniform, knowing it wasn't just fabric and decorations. It was a testament to her perseverance, her strength, and her ability to command respect in a world that hadn't always offered it willingly. Cynthia took a seat by the window, her gaze shifting toward the view of the Washington skyline. In the distance, she could see the Capitol building, its dome a symbol of the power struggles that defined the city. But power here wasn't just about politics. It was about influence, control, and who could outmaneuver whom. That evening, a pre-summit dinner was scheduled, an informal gathering meant to ease tensions and allow participants to mingle before the official discussions began. Cynthia knew from experience that these dinners were anything but casual. It was in these moments, before the formalities, that alliances were formed, deals were made, and strategies were set in motion. She dressed carefully, opting for a sleek, tailored black dress that balanced formality with approachability. She knew how to present herself, polished, professional, but never stiff. As she entered the private dining room, she was greeted by a sea of familiar faces. Admirals from other nations, diplomats, and political figures were already engaged in conversations, their voices low but animated. Cynthia immediately noticed the clusters of people, the informal hierarchies that had already formed. The U.S. delegation was positioned in the center, commanding attention, while smaller nations and newer attendees gravitated toward the edges. She moved through the room with purpose, exchanging polite greetings and shaking hands with colleagues. But she was always aware of the undercurrents, the glances exchanged, the subtle shifts in body language as she approached. As the only black woman of her rank, she was used to the extra attention, used to being noticed in ways that others weren't. But tonight, she felt something different. There was a heightened sense of anticipation in the room, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen, waiting for the first shot to be fired in the battle of ideas that would unfold over the next few days. She took her seat at the U.S. delegation's table, nodding to Admiral Mark Harrington, the Chief of Naval Operations, who sat across from her. Harrington had been a mentor to her throughout her career, one of the few who had consistently supported her rise through the ranks. But even with his backing, Cynthia knew she would have to navigate this summit with precision. The U.S. delegation was under intense pressure to reaffirm its dominance on the global stage, particularly in light of recent geopolitical shifts. Harrington leaned across the table, his voice low but firm. "We're expecting a lot of pushback on the South China Sea," he said, his eyes locking with Cynthia's. "But I know you've got this. You've been there. You know those waters better than anyone in this room." Cynthia nodded, grateful for his confidence, but fully aware of the complexities ahead. "I've reviewed the latest intel," she replied, "and I think we have a strong position, but we need to be prepared for some hard lines from China and Russia. They're looking to test us, see how far they can push." Harrington's expression darkened. "They'll push, all right, and that's why we need you to push back harder. Don't give them an inch." The dinner continued, filled with polite conversation, but Cynthia's mind was already deep in strategy mode. She observed the other tables, noting the interactions between delegations. She watched as Admiral Lai Wei of China spoke quietly with his team, his demeanor calm but calculating. Across the room, she caught a glimpse of Admiral Sergei Ivanov from Russia, his sharp eyes scanning the room like a predator assessing his prey. Cynthia knew that these men viewed her as an anomaly, perhaps even a threat. A woman of her stature and rank was still a rarity in military circles, especially one who wielded as much influence as she did. But what they didn't realize was that Cynthia had spent her entire career navigating rooms like this, rooms filled with powerful men who underestimated her, rooms where she had to fight for every inch of respect. As the dinner came to a close, and the participants began to disperse, Cynthia remained seated for a moment, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her wineglass. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The formal sessions would open, and the debates would start in earnest. She knew that every word she spoke would be analyzed, every decision dissected, but she was ready. This summit wasn't just about maritime security. It was about leadership, influence, and the future of global power. Cynthia had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to allow anyone to question her right to be there. Tomorrow, she would walk into that room not just as an admiral, but as a force to be reckoned with. The world was changing, and Cynthia Taylor was at the helm of that change. The storm inside the room. The next morning, Cynthia Taylor stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of her uniform. It was a ritual she had performed countless times, but today it carried a heightened sense of purpose. The summit room awaited, filled with powerful men and women, all with their own agendas and their own visions for the future of maritime security. Cynthia's reflection stared back at her, not just a high-ranking admiral, but a black woman who had defied expectations at every turn. Today, she would need every ounce of that strength, focus, and resilience. She fastened the last button, smoothing the pristine fabric as she straightened her back. The 4 stars on her shoulders gleamed under the soft hotel lighting. Admiral Taylor, the name had weight. The title had taken years to earn, through countless trials, physical, mental, and emotional. But today, it was about more than the rank. It was about influence, power, and respect. The summit's opening session was set to be one of the most critical, focusing on the South China Sea, where tensions between the United States, China, and other nations had escalated in recent months. This was Cynthia's territory, both figuratively and literally. She had commanded naval forces in those waters and knew them as intimately as anyone. She had felt the weight of the waters beneath her command ship, the endless stretch of the horizon where politics and geography collided. Today, her challenge wasn't just to assert the U.S. position, but to ensure that her voice, as a woman, as a leader, and as a strategist, would not be drowned out by the louder, more traditional voices in the room. The summit's meeting room was designed for grandeur. Massive glass windows overlooked the heart of Washington, D.C., with a view of the Capitol in the distance. The long, oval-shaped table at the center was draped in white cloth, with small country flags representing each delegation. Around it, dozens of chairs were neatly arranged, and nameplates identified the military and political leaders who would soon fill them. The room was already buzzing with conversation as diplomats and naval officers filed in, exchanging pleasantries and setting the stage for the discussions to come. Cynthia entered with the rest of the U.S. delegation, walking with a quiet confidence that belied the storm brewing inside her. She was acutely aware of the eyes that followed her as she took her place at the table. There were whispers, subtle glances exchanged between some of the international attendees, but she paid them no mind. She was no stranger to being underestimated. What mattered now was not their initial perceptions, but the weight of her words when the time came to speak. As she settled into her seat, she saw familiar faces from previous summits. Admiral Lai Wei from China sat across the table, his expression inscrutable, but Cynthia knew better than to assume his calm exterior meant he was indifferent. China's interests in the South China Sea were deeply entrenched, and Lai was known for being both a shrewd negotiator and a staunch defender of China's naval ambitions. To his right sat Admiral Sergei Ivanov of Russia, his cold, calculating eyes sweeping the room like a hawk assessing prey. He was a man of few words, but his presence alone was enough to remind everyone of Russia's growing assertiveness in the Arctic and beyond. As the other delegations settled into their seats, a hush fell over the room. Admiral Harrington, the head of the U.S. delegation, stood to deliver his opening remarks. He spoke with the authority and poise expected of his position, outlining the U.S. stance on maritime security and the importance of maintaining stability in international waters. His words were measured, diplomatic, but firm, a signal to the room that the United States was not going to back down from its global leadership role. But Cynthia knew that Harrington's speech was only the beginning. The real discussions would happen once the formalities were out of the way, once the room divided into smaller groups and the real power plays began. It was in those moments that alliances were tested, boundaries pushed, and strategies shifted. And it was in those moments that Cynthia intended to make her mark. When the time came for the South China Sea discussion, Cynthia leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the polished wood of the table. As Harrington introduced her to the group, her introduction was short but powerful. Her rank and expertise in the region spoke for itself. Yet, as she prepared to speak, she noticed the familiar look from some of her international counterparts, the slight narrowing of eyes, the quick glances exchanged between them. It wasn't overt, but she could feel it, the doubt, the hesitation. Could she really lead this discussion? Could she, a black woman, hold her own in this room filled with naval titans and geopolitical strategists? Cynthia allowed the moment to hang in the air for just a beat longer than necessary before she began speaking. Admirals, distinguished colleagues, I'm here to discuss not just policy, but reality. Cynthia began, her voice calm but firm. The South China Sea is not simply a theoretical chessboard where we move pieces around. It's a region that affects the global economy, trade routes, and the lives of millions. I've commanded operations there, and I know firsthand the stakes we're facing. As she spoke, she noticed the shift in the room. The murmurs quieted, and eyes began to focus more intently on her. There was something about the way she spoke that commanded attention, not just because of her title, but because she spoke from experience, from a place of deep understanding. We're not just dealing with military strategy here. We're dealing with a delicate balance of power, one that, if upset, could trigger not just regional conflict but global repercussions, Cynthia continued. And let me be clear, the United States has no intention of allowing any one nation to destabilize that balance. Her words landed with precision. Admiral Li Wei's expression remained unchanged, but Cynthia could see the subtle tightening of his grip on the armrest of his chair. He knew that she was addressing China's increasingly aggressive actions in the South China Sea, and the implications were clear. Cynthia wasn't here to sugarcoat the issue or play diplomatic games. She was here to assert the United States' position, and she wasn't going to let anyone, man or woman, ally or adversary, diminish her authority. As she finished her opening remarks, the room remained silent for a moment longer before Admiral Li Wei leaned forward, speaking in measured tones that contrasted with Cynthia's directness. Admiral Taylor, we appreciate your insights, but let us not forget that the South China Sea is historically Chinese territory. Our presence there is not one of aggression, but of rightful defense. Cynthia didn't flinch. She had anticipated this response, and she was ready. With all due respect, Admiral Li, Cynthia replied, her voice calm but unyielding. The international community recognizes those waters as international. And while history is important, so is the future. We must look forward, not backward, if we're to ensure stability. The tension in the room thickened as other delegates began to weigh in. Admiral Ivanov, his voice low and gravelly, added, "It seems the question is not about history, but about who controls the future. And as we all know, the future is not determined by words, but by actions." Cynthia didn't miss the veiled threat in Ivanov's words, nor the ripple of unease that passed through the room. The conversation was turning toward dangerous waters, where diplomacy was fragile and conflict loomed just beneath the surface. But this was where Cynthia thrived, in the heart of the storm, where her calm, strategic mind could cut through the chaos. She wasn't rattled by threats or posturing. She had seen too much, commanded too many missions, and survived too many battles, both in her career and in her personal journey, to be intimidated now. "The future," Cynthia said, her voice carrying over the rising tension, "will be shaped by those who prioritize stability, security, and cooperation. It will not be shaped by those who seek to dominate through intimidation." Her words were a direct challenge, but they were also a statement of fact. The United States, under her leadership, would not be cowed by aggression or fear. She met Admiral Ivanov's gaze evenly, unflinching, before turning her attention back to the rest of the room. "We are all here because we understand the stakes," Cynthia continued. "We have a responsibility, not just to our nations, but to the world, to ensure that our actions promote peace and security, not conflict. That is what I'm here to discuss, and that is what we must focus on." The room fell into a heavy silence once again, but this time, the weight was different. Cynthia had shifted the conversation. She had taken control, not through force, but through a quiet, unwavering strength. The men in the room might have come in doubting her, questioning whether she belonged, but now they saw her for what she was, a leader, a strategist, and a force to be reckoned with. As the session drew to a close, Cynthia could feel the energy in the room had changed. There would be more battles to come, more discussions that would test her resolve, but for now, she had made her presence felt. She had shown them who she was, Admiral Cynthia Taylor, a woman who had earned her place at this table and would not be silenced. The storm inside the room had calmed, but the undercurrents remained. Cynthia knew that this was just the beginning, but she was ready for whatever came next. Commanding the future. As the summit continued, Cynthia Taylor found herself at the center of the most critical discussions. The initial tension had given way to a different energy, an unspoken acknowledgement of her authority. She had shifted the dynamics, no longer just a participant in the room, but a driving force behind many of the most important decisions being made. The undercurrents of doubt and skepticism that had greeted her at the beginning of the summit had faded, replaced by a respect that was as much a recognition of her intellect as her leadership. But Cynthia knew that in these arenas, respect was fragile, fleeting. There was always another challenge ahead, another battle to win. The final day of the summit was the most important. It was where the real deals would be made, where alliances would be solidified, and where the future of maritime security would be decided. Cynthia sat in her hotel room that morning, her uniform hanging in the closet behind her, while she reviewed the final briefings and intelligence reports. The hours ahead would determine the course of not just naval policy, but the global order for years to come. The stakes couldn't be higher, and she could feel the weight of that responsibility bearing down on her. Yet despite the pressure, Cynthia felt a sense of calm. She had prepared for this moment her entire career. Every obstacle, every battle, every moment of doubt from others had led to this. She wasn't just representing herself. She was representing the U.S. Navy, her country, and the thousands of men and women who served under her. But even more than that, she was representing those who would come after her, the next generation of leaders who would look to her as a trailblazer. As she dressed in her uniform, she thought about her journey. The path had never been easy. From her early days at the Naval Academy, where she had been one of the few black women in her class, to her rise through the ranks, where she constantly had to prove herself in ways her male counterparts never did. She remembered the long nights spent studying, training, and outworking everyone around her just to be seen as equal. And even then, there were times when her capabilities were questioned, not because of her skill or intelligence, but because of her gender and the color of her skin. The uniform she wore now was both a symbol of her success and a reminder of the struggles she had faced. It was a suit of armor, yes, but it also carried the weight of the expectations placed on her, both from those who doubted her and from those who saw her as a beacon of hope. She had learned to carry that weight with grace, but it had taken years to perfect. Now she stood ready to face the final day of the summit with the same determination that had carried her through every challenge before. Cynthia arrived at the summit room to find it buzzing with activity. The various delegations were engaged in last-minute talks, huddled together in small groups, making their final preparations before the formal sessions began. The tension in the air was palpable. Today, the real negotiations would take place, and the decisions made here would ripple across the globe. She took her seat at the table, flanked by the rest of the U.S. delegation, including Admiral Harrington, who had been her mentor and ally throughout the summit. He leaned over to her, his voice low. "Today's the day we lock this in. China's going to push hard, and so will Russia. But we need to stand firm." Cynthia nodded, already anticipating the resistance they would face. The South China Sea had been the primary point of contention throughout the summit, with China asserting its territorial claims and the U.S. pushing back, insisting on the importance of maintaining international waters and freedom of navigation. The issue wasn't just about territory, it was about power. Whoever controlled the South China Sea controlled one of the most important trade routes in the world, and with it, significant global influence. As the session began, Admiral Lai Wei from China spoke first, his voice calm and measured, but carrying the weight of his country's position. The South China Sea is, and has always been, under Chinese jurisdiction, he said, his words met with nods from his delegation. Our actions in the region are not about aggression, but about protecting our national interests. We have no desire for conflict, but we will not back down from what is rightfully ours. Cynthia listened carefully, her expression impassive. She had heard variations of this argument many times before, but she knew better than to react too quickly. In these rooms, silence was often a weapon. Letting your opponent speak first, letting them reveal their hand, was a strategy in itself. When it was her turn to speak, she leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the table. Her voice was steady, but there was a firmness to it that commanded attention. The United States is committed to maintaining peace and stability in the South China Sea, she began, her gaze sweeping the room. But let me be clear, peace does not come from unilateral actions that undermine international law. The South China Sea is a vital global trade route, and any attempt to restrict freedom of navigation in those waters threatens not just regional security, but global stability. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. We recognize China's historical ties to the region, but history cannot be used as a justification for disregarding international norms. The future of the South China Sea should be one of cooperation, not domination. And we, the United States, will continue to ensure that these waters remain open to all. Her words were met with silence, but she could see the shift in the room. The tension was thick, but now it was different. Her statement had cut through the diplomatic language and gone straight to the heart of the issue. She had drawn a line, and everyone in the room knew it. Admiral Li Wei's expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps surprise at her directness, or perhaps frustration that she had so effectively countered his argument. He leaned back in his chair, exchanging a quick glance with one of his aides before responding. "Admiral Taylor," he said, his tone carefully measured, "we understand your position, but we must protect our sovereignty. Cooperation is always our goal, but we cannot sacrifice our national interests in the process." Cynthia didn't flinch. She had expected this. "Sovereignty is important," she replied. "But so is the sovereignty of other nations. The waters of the South China Sea do not belong to one nation. They belong to the world." For the next hour, the room was filled with back-and-forth discussions, with each nation presenting its case, pushing for its interests. Cynthia remained composed throughout, responding when necessary, but always listening, always calculating. She knew that this wasn't just about what was said in the room. It was about the alliances being formed behind the scenes, the subtle shifts in power dynamics that would ultimately shape the outcome. As the discussions wore on, it became clear that the United States, with Cynthia at the helm, had solidified its position. While China remained firm in its claims, the other nations in the room began to align more closely with the U.S. stance, recognizing the importance of maintaining open waters and preventing any one nation from dominating the region. When the session finally ended, there was a palpable sense of relief in the room. The agreements made were not perfect, but they represented a significant step forward in maintaining stability in the South China Sea. Cynthia had done what she came to do. She had led her delegation with strength and clarity, and she had ensured that the U.S. position was not just heard, but respected. As the room began to clear, Admiral Harrington approached her, a satisfied smile on his face. "You did it, Cynthia. That was masterful." Cynthia smiled, but it was a quiet, knowing smile. "It's not over yet," she said. "There will be more challenges ahead. But for now, we've held our ground." Harrington nodded. "You've more than held your ground. You've set the tone for what comes next." Cynthia knew he was right. The decisions made at this summit would have lasting repercussions, not just for the U.S. Navy, but for global security. And while there would always be new challenges, new battles to fight, she had proven once again that she belonged at the table, that her voice mattered. As she left the summit room, the weight of the last few days began to lift, replaced by a sense of quiet pride. She had commanded the room, navigated the storm, and emerged stronger. But more than that, she had opened doors, for herself, for the Navy, and for those who would follow in her footsteps. She thought back to her grandmother's words, the ones that had guided her for so long. "You'll be the first in many rooms, Cynthia, but you won't be the last." And she knew, in her heart, that she wouldn't be. The future was wide open, and she was ready to lead it.